Washington State University. Here with us in Howard, Dr. Jean-Michel Mabeko-Tali, Professor, African History. Dr. Clement Akassi, did I say it correctly?
Yes.
Dr. Clement Akassi, Associate Professor, Modern Languages, an expert in diasporan culture in Latin America and the Caribbean from the Department of Modern Languages. Dr. Quito Swan, Associate Professor of History, Department of History, Specialty, the African Diaspora. History Department, Professor of History, U.S. History, and Specialty of the History of Southern America Direct. Again, welcome to everyone. To outline this examination procedure, the candidate will summarize the dissertation as follows in 10 to 15 minutes. How the initial interest in this topic began, a summary of the research done, a summary of your findings. We will then have an initial round of questioning, by the examination committee members. That will be followed by a second and follow-up round of questioning from the committee members. Then we will take a question from the other members of the university committee. The candidate and the audience will then be excused to permit the committee to deliberate. The committee decision, evaluation, discussion, and recommendations will then follow. The major advisor will recall the candidate and inform him of the committee's decision, and this meeting will then be adjourned. I would like to ask, as Mr. Vaz makes his presentation, that he understand we don't need you to work up a storm here. We'd like you to make sure that our building continues to stand after you're finished, since you bring so much storm, smoke, and power in your presentations. We thank you so much for all your hard work, and we look forward to your presentation, 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you again.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out, family, friends, professors, everybody. Like I said before, the title of this dissertation is Dominica's Neg Mawon, Maroons, Diaspora and Transatlantic Network, 1763 to 1814. This is a photo of me and Dominica in August of 2015. This is a statue of one of the Maroons known as Jacko. This is in the town of Roseau, right downtown. Now the process, how I got interested in this topic. Well, it was a long journey, first of all. About 5 years ago when I first joined the PhD program, I knew there was like a few things I wanted to talk about. One of the things I knew I wanted to talk about was African cultural continuity in the diaspora. Another thing I wanted to make sure I discussed was African resistance to enslavement. The third thing I wanted to make sure I discussed, well, I wanted to make sure I didn't actually discuss something, a subject that was actually happening, or a discussion that was actually someone has already done multiple times. I want to do a rare subject. And then the fourth thing I wanted to make sure I discussed was something that hit close to home. See, my parents are from the West Indies, my dad is from Jamaica, my mom's from Grenada. But that eliminated Jamaica out of the process because Jamaica has been an island and topic that's been discussed so many times. So I originally wanted to do resistance in Grenada. But as I was doing the research about resistance in Grenada, I realized there was a historian from Grenada named Curtis Jacobs, who's pretty much trying to do the same type of history that I was trying to do, African cultural continuity in the Fadan Rebellion. So I didn't want to tread on his space, and I wanted to find a space where I can actually discuss something original. I was talking to Dr. Carrington for a while, and he said, why don't you look at the whole subject of the French, and the French and their relations to the African resistance during the 1790s. Why don't you look at the case of the Ceded Islands? And the Ceded Islands being those 4 islands that were ceded to the British in 1763, Tobago, St. Vincent, Dominica, and Grenada. So okay. So I started looking at the Ceded Islands. And one of the islands that stood out the most to me when looking at these Ceded Islands was Dominica. Dominica actually exhibited some of those characteristics that I was looking for. Looking at the secondary sources, some of the Maroon chiefs retained indications of Africanisms. There was a Maroon by the name of Congo Ray, a Maroon by the name of Kwashi, so on and so forth. Another interesting thing about Dominica was that it pretty much had resisted, the Maroon community resisted enslavement for almost 50 years. And some of the Maroon wars that were waged, the biggest Maroon wars that were waged, were actually waged mid-1780s and then in the second decade of the 19th century. And I thought it was fascinating that whereas places like Jamaica and St. Vincent had expelled most of the Maroon populations in the mid-1790s, Dominica's Maroon population had stayed on the island for another almost 20 years. So I said, let me look into Dominica a little more. And as looking through the secondary sources, I realized a lot of the historians like Lennox Honeychurch, who's a Dominican, Michael Creighton, they didn't really necessarily look into the African cultural aspects of the Maroons. They kind of just discussed them as Maroons and didn't really get into the philosophies or maybe in the origin of these people. So one of the problems or research questions that I had, first problem I saw was Dominican nationalism in terms of how the Maroons were discussed with Lennox Honeychurch. He pretty much discusses the Maroons within the confines of Dominica as an island. And there are neighboring islands like Mary Gallant, Guadeloupe, Martinique that are very close to Dominica, which actually affected the politics of Dominica. And then there were also the influx of Africans coming after 1763, which also influenced the politics of Dominica. So I wanted to take this history outside the confines of Dominica nationalism. And then historians tend to discuss the French influence. Because one thing about Dominica, like I just mentioned, Dominica was surrounded by French islands, Mary Gallant, Martinique, and Guadeloupe. They also had a large French inhabitant population. So a lot of times when, kind of like what we were discussing in Haji's defense yesterday, a lot of times people attribute African resistance to somebody else instigating these people to rise up. And a lot of times people often attribute these Maroons for rising up, or the Africans on the plantation rising up, they attribute it to the French on the island, especially during the French Revolution. So I had the question, who were the Dominica's Maroons? And what was their connection to the greater diaspora? And to what extent was there movement and cohesion with the French? And the method I was going to go about finding these answers, well, online you had the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. Also in the United Kingdom, you had the archives of Kew Gardens, T71 papers, which gives basically the Slave Registry starting right around 1816, right after the Second Maroon War. They started to actually take an in-depth documentation of each slave on every plantation, the nation they came from, the country marks, and so on and so forth, the names of the people, and so on and so forth. I also went to, and also in Kew Gardens with the CO papers. I also went to France for a short period of time. Les Archives Nationales de l'Outre-mer. I like my French. I also went to Dominica's National Archives, and then downstairs was Dominica's Documentation Center. And online there was newspapers from the U.S., London, and Bermuda, where I got a great part of this information. And then they also complemented this with secondary sources. So going through these archives and these different sources, I found that the vast majority, or great majority of the Africans in Dominica were either Igbo or were the descendants of Igbo people. And in order to understand, even though there were other people on the island, other different African ethnics on this island, you had the Mandingo, you had the Coromantee, and so on and so forth. Even though you had these different ethnic groups, one can't understand the resistance in Dominica without understanding the Igbo people, because the Igbo people made the foundation of not only Maroon culture, but the enslaved culture in Dominica. The Igbo people believed in the philosophy of transmigration. Transmigration means basically reincarnation of the soul. And oftentimes they're mischaracterized by planters back then as being a despondent or low-grade type of Negro. They would often consider these Igbo to be prone to suicide because they were often sad and depressed and despondent. But I think the suicide was more a testament to their high-spiritedness and their pride. To rather die than actually be enslaved. Live free or die trying. And then I also found that this was an autonomous movement, a very independent movement. The two major wars that were waged by the Maroons fell outside of the revolutionary decade of the 1790s. Fell outside of the French Revolutionary decade of that period. And oftentimes when the French often tried to get Maroon assistance in their politics, you find the Maroons often reject this Maroon assistance. The Maroons actually reject this French assistance, and vice versa. So these are my findings. And I'm going to do a brief breakdown of each chapter. Chapter 1 I call African Origins, Ethnicity, Spirituality, and Philosophy of the Neg Mawon of Dominica. So basically in this chapter I break down each region of Africa, each ethnic zone of Africa, Senegambia all the way down to West Central Africa. And I discuss some of the different Maroon chiefs and some of the different participants in some of these rebellions who actually participated. And I discuss some of the ships that they possibly could have been on from the African continent into Dominica. So in this chapter, I'm basically discussing the roots of the Africans. On the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, it says that 56% of all Africans transported into Dominica came from the Bight of Biafra. Of this 56% who were transported from the Bight of Biafra, 85% of them came from only 3 ports: Bani, Calabar, and New Calabar. Now, if anybody knows anything about these 3 ports, there was heavy Igbo traffic coming through these 3 ports. But I wasn't quite satisfied with that because we know there's such thing as transshipment and clusters and Africans being taken from the hinterland. So I wanted to go a step further to actually find out if these Africans are being retained on the island. So one of the things I did, I went to the Slave Registry, and because the Slave Registry doesn't become detailed until 1816 or 1817, around then, I couldn't quite get a picture of the entire period from 1763 to 1814. But what it did tell me was that even in the 1816, 1817 Slave Registry, the vast majority of Africans on plantations were either Creole, meaning they were born somewhere in America, Dominica or some of the neighboring islands, or they were actually Igbo, of the Igbo nation. And even those Creoles, a lot of times when you look at the Creoles, a lot of times they were children of Igbo people. So those two were the major groups in the Slave Registry. And then also going through the notes and going through the different documents, you also see that, like, the Igbo are the most referenced group when you go through documents in the colonial office papers and so on and so forth. Here's can't really see that, but this is an example of one of the papers, Igbo, so on and so forth, all the way down, children, people. This is a typical plantation document from Dominica. Chapter 2, so whereas in the first chapter I talk about the roots, R-O-T-S, the second chapter I'm talking about the roots, or routes, R-O-U-T-E-S. And Africans ended up coming to Dominica in different ways other than just ships straight from Africa. So you had Maritime Maroon Network, banished rebels, and routes to Dominica. Talk a little about the domestic Maroons, the ones that basically escaped the plantations right upon the transition period between the island being ceded to the British in 1763. There was a lot of Africans that fled during that transitionary period. And then there was also Maritime Maroon Network. So there were Africans who were traveling from some of the neighboring French islands, some of them sometimes going back and forth between islands. And then you had banished rebels. Banished rebels, you had a few slave revolts that happened in the West Indies at the time, in the 1760s and 1770s, in Montserrat, Grenada, Tobago, and Carriacou. And, well, this right here is a photo, actually, of me and my family in Grenada. This is where actually a lot of the Maroons actually resided. We were actually in that same location. There's a long story behind that. We ended up getting lost in the woods, but that's a side note. But these four islands here experienced insurrections in the 1760s and 1770s. And it was Dominica that was actually receiving the banished rebels from these insurrections. Dominica was like a dump land for rebellious slaves. And here's one of the documents that stated that they wanted to prohibit the importation of rebellious Negroes into Dominica. It's found in the National Archives. So by the early 1770s, Grenada's Maroon population had been quelled. Many of the insurrections in some of the other islands have faded. Now you start to see Dominica start to develop a more formidable, stronger Maroon population in the interior of the island. This was one of the first runaway slave acts, which you'll find out later was virtually ineffective to how they were actually going to punish these Maroons. In the late part of this chapter, in the late 1770s, the French occupied Dominica again during the America's War of Independence. And at this point, the French governor that came into the island armed the Maroons to help defend the island against an internal insurrection by the British or an external invasion. At the end of that chapter, the island gets retroceded back to the British. There's a treaty involved between the French and the British, but the Maroons are actually left out of this treaty. So this chapter, chapter 3, entitled General Bala, Obia, and War, I basically discuss how the Maroons took the initiative during this time period from 1784 to 1786 to extirpate the British dogs. That was a term that they used in the records. They wanted to extirpate the British dogs from the island, and they went all-out war. But eventually, at the end of this chapter, I discussed that eventually Bala was killed. Right before Bala was killed, he said he doesn't care if you kill me because my soul, my spirit will still live on in the woods. The only thing he seemed to be concerned about was his OB apparatus and his child. The following chapter, chapter 4, the 1791 conspiracy, Maroons, Mulattoes, and Enslaved Rebels. This is also a picture of me in Dominica's woods. I didn't get lost this time, but this is the location that Chief Farcell, the Maroon, operated from, next to right next to Grand Bay, Dominica, in the southeast part of the island. Now, in this chapter, I discussed that whereas a lot of historians in the past discussed that the conspiracy was a joint Maroon, Mulatto, and enslaved conspiracy, I argue that this was a conspiracy that was started by Chief Farcell, where he tried to get the Maroons, he tried to get the enslaved Africans on the plantations to join with the Maroons and murder all of the whites on the windward side of the island. And then there was a mulatto by the name of Apollinaire who came from Martinique, who actually joined in on the conspiracy. But once Apollinaire joined in on the conspiracy, Farcell seemed to be a no-show for the rest of the time that they were conspiring. So this chapter basically discusses some of the nuances with this 1791 conspiracy. And eventually, Apollinaire was captured and killed, and Farcell remained out in the woods. Chapter 5, African alliances vied for by European nations. This chapter discusses the political situation of the 1790s, the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, the war between Britain and France, and the importation of the West Indian Regiment into Dominica. This right here, this document right here, is a letter written to Farcell by a French revolutionary Republican. Now this chapter is a very complicated chapter. It shows basically Farcell allying himself with different people at different times, depending upon basically whichever way the political wind was blowing at the time. Farcell actually was a chief, but he and 12 of his followers actually separated themselves from the rest of the Maroons and eventually signed a treaty with the British colonial government in Dominica, whereas the vast majority of Maroons remained uncompromising. Eventually, once the West Indian Regiment was imported into the island, the colonial government had no more use for Farcell, and they started accusing him of all types of things, of treachery and all these other types of things. And eventually, the West Indian Regiment was used or complemented with other troops to basically try to minimize the resistance by the Maroon community during that time period. And then chapter 7, we are all Maroons. This chapter basically discusses how the wedge between enslaved Africans on plantations and Maroons in the woods was pretty much blurred during this time period. At first you had a surreptitious trading network going on, like an underground trading network going on between Maroons and enslaved Africans on plantations. And then that developed into an all-out, in the open, I don't care what you think type of attitude that people started having. You would often find, the planters would often find slaves in the woods for extended periods of time, and they would find Maroons on plantations. And the British colonial government started to worry that this was going to turn into another Saint-Domingue. And in this chapter, I note that Governor Ainsley, he became the new governor in 1813, and he realized you can't just defeat these Maroons like you defeat a regular group of troops. Like you have to, there's something else deeper to their philosophies. And you realize one of the ways you have to defeat these people is heed to their cosmology. And he realized that simply killing these people and executing these people is not going to deter anybody. You have to do more than that. So Governor Ainsley realized that the Igbo believed that if their bodies are mutilated, then their souls will not transmigrate. So what Governor Ainsley started to do at that point is he made an example of about 10 or 11 Africans from February 1814 to May 1814. And after execution, out in the public so everybody can see, he made sure he burned the bodies of those people he executed to prevent these people's souls from transmigrating back to the African continent or back to the woods amongst their families. And this is a document, one of the documents where he notes, he talks about the Igbo and the Mandingo belief in the transmigration of the soul. So, conclusion, African philosophies guided resistance, particularly the Igbo, who made up a large portion of the Dominican population. There was an African Maroon / enslaved alliance that took precedent over any other alliances. It seemed that the Africans sought out the enslaved Africans, the African Maroons sought out the enslaved Africans on plantations, and it was reciprocal for an alliance. The goal was a takeover of the entire island. So you see multiple occasions throughout the 1780s, 1790s, and also in the second decade of the 19th century. The goal seemed to be an ultimate takeover of the entire island. And the colonial government finds desired results against the Maroons when it heeded to Igbo African principles of philosophy and cosmology and so on and so forth. And that's the that's all.
Thank you for your presentation. And as is our tradition, we begin with our outside examiner, Dr. Chambers, Associate Professor of History, Michigan State University.
Dr. Chambers, can you hear us?
Air keep going in and out.
Okay, basically, Dr. Clark, you asked you to ask Neil the first question as you're the external examiner. We can hear you.
Okay, it sounds good. I really enjoyed the dissertation. Thank you all for allowing me to serve, actually, as an outside reader. Very impressive scholarship, very impressive archival research. And I appreciate the argument, really, and what Neil is going against. However, my question is, I'm seeing a very developed case for the connections within the Maroon communities across various African ethnicities and people who are coming from neighboring islands. But I guess I'm still looking to see more of the interaction that's taking place between the Neg Mawon and the enslaved population in general. So I guess what I'm getting at is, is there a consistent type of collaboration, or they're seeing themselves as working in unison in order to end the enslaved system on the island of Dominica specifically? And I guess I'm framing this in the context of you challenge sort of the restorationist arguments, the separatist arguments that have sort of been used in the cases of Jamaica and Haiti. How is Dominica different? I'm still struggling with that.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. You see, when I was looking at the sources, in the 1780s, you don't see as much evidence of a Maroon enslaved alliance. But definitely in the 1791 conspiracy, you definitely see Parcell reach out to the enslaved population. And he basically sets up a number of chiefs and sub-chiefs on various plantations in the southeast corner of Dominica. And it was from there he planned on waging this what he termed as murder all the whites. Because at the time, many of the enslaved Africans on the plantations were pretty upset because they thought that with the Amelioration Act that was passed in 1788, they thought they were going to get 3 days off of work. And they simply just started to strike. They weren't going to work. What Parcell did was he took advantage of this, and he went on to these plantations and he said, don't just simply strike. Let's go all out. Because at the end of the day, you're still going to be slaves. You're still going to be working for these people. So let's go all out and actually murder all the whites and create a free society. That was in 1791. That's when we first start to see significant evidence of the Maroons reaching out to the enslaved population and vice versa. And then, and definitely in the second decade of the 19th century, after there was two major natural disasters in 1806. There was an earthquake, and then there was a hurricane. And this earthquake and this hurricane caused so much famine throughout the island. People were dying, and it got to the point where people were just starting to depend upon their own devices to basically just go out and find their own food. But these hurricanes didn't seem to affect the Maroons in the interior as much as it did the people along the coast. And if you're familiar with the way the island is, I mean, Dominica is very, very mountainous and has 365 rivers. So when you have a natural disaster like that, like a hurricane, mudslides affect the coast way more than they would affect people in the interior. So it seems as though that the people in the interior, which were the Maroons, still had an abundance of food compared to the people along the coast. So the enslaved Africans on plantations started going to the Maroons in order to trade. But they would have the enslaved Africans would have like tools, they would have guns, they would have gunpowder, they would have salt that they would bring from plantations. And what the Maroons would have in the woods was an abundance of ground provisions, mostly yams. So this is what they were trading back and forth with one another, and they're helping each other survive in a sense. And it was from this relationship, I think, as a result of these natural disasters,